Hello, Reformed. This is the video for week 4, day 1. So we've seen the church in week 1. In week 2, we looked at the 5 solas, the 5 alones of the Reformation. Last week, we saw the 5 points of Calvinism, especially as we see them in the canons of Dort. And starting today, we're beginning a 2-week little series on covenant theology. It's a very important topic, and today's video is on the subject, the topic of covenant itself. So why is this important, and what do we mean when we say this word, covenant? Well, the concept of covenant is very important for understanding the story of the Bible, what God is telling us in His Word. We've seen already that the Scriptures are our highest authority for faith, doctrine, and the Christian life. And since this is the case, we need to understand what it is that they are saying to us. And the Bible itself has its own way of organizing its story and telling it to us, and that is the way of covenant. So in order to see what God is saying in His Word, we need to see what the storyline of the Bible is, and the Bible presents this to us in various covenants. We think of Adam or Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, very familiar faces from the pages of the Old Testament, and they all have a certain covenant associated with them. Or we come to the New Testament, and Christ says that He brings the new covenant with Him in His blood. So we see that covenant is a very important thing throughout the Bible. It's a very important thing for us to understand what the Bible is saying. And as we'll see when we get to the new covenant especially, it's a very important thing for us to understand about ourselves and our salvation and our place in the covenant people of God. So what then is a good definition of covenant? Well, one of the simplest and easiest ways to understand covenant is to think of it in this way. A covenant is an agreement that creates a legal relationship. An agreement that creates a legal relationship. So it's an agreement. It has at least 2 parties that come together for a specific purpose. And because of that agreement, a relationship is created. These 2 parties are now interacting with each other in certain specific ways as a result of this covenant being made. It's also a legal agreement, a legal relationship. It's binding. And if the covenant is kept, good things will happen. But if the covenant is broken, bad things will happen. So as we think of this concept of covenant, the thing that probably could come to our mind first is the idea of marriage. Indeed, marriage is one of the few things left in our society that still uses the term covenant. We could talk about the marriage covenant. And what happens when 2 people get married? Well, they have a ceremony, a covenant ceremony. They stand in front of God and witnesses, which is something that would have happened all the time in the ancient Near East that ancient Israel knew. They exchange vows, promises to each other, and rings, signs and symbols of those promises. And they have a relationship that begins there that's different than what came before. They're now interacting with each other in defined and different ways than previously. We know it's also binding. It's a legal thing. Although the love is there between the 2 people, it's also a binding agreement. And for example, if the covenant is broken, there's a legal, something bad happens legally, there is a divorce. So we think of this, these are all the main parts of a covenant, things that we'll see in the coming weeks in the different parts of the biblical story. And I'll end this video with the words of Jeremiah 34. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them up out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and teach his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me. From the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. So this is a promise of the gospel. This is the promise of Christ, the coming Messiah. And the Old Testament gives it to us. God gives it to us in the language of covenant. So covenant is a very important thing for us to understand. And this is what covenant is. And we'll be expanding on this in the weeks to come.